So the name of the conference is Closing the Gap. And I want to tell you what that means and why it's important. From the time we started the war on cancer in '71, we made some gains, slow but sure. In the last 20 years, we've averaged about 0.5% per year in a change and improvement in the survivability curve. In the early 90s, that 0.5% per year was gained with about $1 billion a year in R&D. And this year, we'll get 0.5% per year for $10 billion a month. That's a cost curve that can't survive. We are already seeing drugs that were effective and priced so high that it's difficult to find cases that will allow them to pay for it. And those high prices are the residual of all that problems we had, the blocks and difficulty getting there over the past 20 years. We can't afford that. We can't afford to continue. And I still expect to see cures come forward. So what's blocking it is no mystery. Anybody who looks at the entire process of going from discovery to the patient's bedside knows exactly what it is. It is the secretive, randomized clinical trials, phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 1 is to determine if they're harmless. And once they pass phase 1, they reach what I call acceptable levels. And at that point in phase 1, where the levels are acceptable, usually runs 1 or 2 investigators, perhaps a half a dozen to a dozen or more patients, 18 months and $1 million or $2 million. And at that point, progress stops, discovery stops, there's no more new information coming out for the next 7 to 10 years. And after 7 to 10 years of hidden data, blocked from the very guys who invented the treatment that are started, we may just get a trickle out the other end. On the other hand, we have 6,000 clinical trials for cancer working their way through right now, phase 2 and phase 3. And 93% of them will be failures. And the ones that are passing, the failures as well, cost $200, $300, $400 million. We don't think that can continue. The randomized clinical trials possibly make some sense. If you are someone who has a cancer or an illness with a 6-year, 7-year lifetime, some of the work Doug Yee has done, for example, on breast cancer, where he's improved survivability. If you find out, when you go in to see what's wrong, what's this troublesome lump, or why don't I feel well, and you find out it's a cancer that has a 7-year expected survival, that's one thing. And then they tell you, and you say, inevitably, I've been there about a dozen times myself, and I know a lot of you are practicing physicians. You've seen a lot more than I have. And the question immediately is, isn't there anything else? Is there something better I can do? And for the people that have 7 to 10-year lifetimes, and they say, no, this is it, the standard of care, it's acceptable. But if you have one of the deadly diseases, and that's why this conference is called Closing the Gap for the Deadliest Diseases. If you have 5 months lifetime melanoma, or a bile duct cancer, or pancreatic, or glioblastoma, and they tell you, well, there's some new stuff coming out, but it's just going into phase 2 or 3. And when can I see it? Well, you're not eligible because you don't fit all the criteria. You're not old enough or too young, or you previously had some treatment. And so you can't get it. When will I see the results? Well, you've got standard of care now. You'll see it in 7 to 10 years. That's not very heartening. That's a death sentence. And we don't think that should exist. We think that entire process of the secret randomized clinical trials is the blockage. It is where 90% of the money is spent, is where 90% of the time is spent, and where about 1% of the information is gained. So we believe that once any treatment for cancer has shown to be acceptable, then any patient who wants to use that drug, fully informed basis, with her physician or oncologist, We call that open access closes the gap. And that means open access for the patient and for the data. And I want you to think about one thing. On the day we get that done, the patient who now has an expectation of short lifetime and a 10-year horizon when something's going to help her, the day we close the gap and open access, that patient, every patient, has compassionate care. They will get, not in 10 years, but in 10 days from that point, the very best treatment that anyone has discovered anywhere in the world for that particular cancer. And the day that that happens, instead of finding developers of drugs, I have talked to half a dozen, who develop the drug and go off and do something else. They can't find any more. They don't know whether it works or not, or why it doesn't work, or what's wrong with it. And that gap, closing the gap, goes from 7 to 10 years to 10 days, and the data starts coming in not in trickles, but in torrents and deluges. Nobody who has one of these deadliest diseases has any hope coming out of any of these phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. You just won't have it. So closing the gap are a bunch of people who work in this field, who want to see it changed, whose heart breaks every time we lose someone. And we hardly knew each other 6 or 8 months ago. And now Bob Goldberg, the poet, one of the 2 poets we have, says we are a band of brothers. And so from a band of brothers, with all your support, this conference is dedicated to Brittany Madden with the hope there'll be no more like it. And this one's for you, kid.
Don't believe the tag. I'm not really a filmmaker. I'm a jeweler. I'm an entrepreneur. And my journey, which brought me here today, my journey into oncology started in 2010 when my brother-in-law, age 31, was diagnosed with a primary glioblastoma. Unfortunately, it was right on his motor track, and I'm sure you're all aware of what that means. His case was identical to her case, and probably about the same age. He was basically escorted to his death and drowned in compassionate fatalism. And I think that the deep anger that took hold of me and took me to come here today to speak to you people is that I think that there's a divide that divides all of us, really, between people who say we can do something about something and people who aren't willing to even try. And you can find it in all walks of life, but you can definitely find it in medicine. And I really don't think there's a place for it in medicine, particularly when you're talking about patients with a terminal diagnosis or who, there's no curative treatment available for. Effectively, it boils down to a fundamental issue of human rights, in my opinion. The idea that a doctor can allow a patient to engage with a certain treatment as opposed to really operate as a consultant in the truest sense of the word, which leaves the determination of their own destiny in the hands of the patient, and the doctor's role should be one of providing as much information as accurately as possible to those patients so they can make that informed decision. I know that doesn't apply to a lot of the patient population, and you guys deal with it day in, day out, and you know that patients are often, they don't want to engage with it, but there is a patient population that does want to engage, and they should be facilitated and enabled, not disabled. And I think it really boils down to, like I said, a fundamental question of human rights. The issue of whether a randomized phase 3 clinical trial breaks the Declaration of Helsinki, Article 5 of which states that the interests of the subject must always prevail, the interests of the subject must always prevail over those of science and society. And I doubt very much there's anybody in this room that would make the case to say that a randomized phase 3 clinical trial today is not in direct contravention of a truth, a moral truth that was laid down underwritten by the World Medical Association and the entire medical practice, effectively. So those were the things that I felt strongly about, and then I realized that there was a sort of paralysis, almost like a wagon being drawn by 5 different horses in different directions, whether it's medical hegemony or legitimate interests of corporate entities, big pharma, or issues, social issues which drive our regulatory structures. And I felt that something needed to be said about it. So I made a film. And whilst I was making this film, one of the recurring themes that kept surfacing in all of the interviews, whether it was patients or doctors, I was lucky enough to get access to some fantastic guys here in America, was this issue of data and its potential as the true accelerator in oncology, or something that we could really, in the era of Google and Apple, and I've been having a great conversation with Kizzy over there about this topic in many fields. You know, why aren't we harnessing that? And people were really angry about it. And so that was a big part of my film. And I was really, really happy when in about March this year, I was working in the neuroscience library as an alumni. I didn't study medicine, but I was an alumni in the same university. And I was working there day in, day out. I'd quit my day job to finish this film. And I was really happy because I thought I'd finished the film. But it was about 4 hours long at that point. So a few cold showers from some professionals and people I really trust made me realize that I needed to start amputating some sections. And one of the most painful parts to depart with was a section about data. And as chance would have it, I then had the great fortune to meet the one and only Mr. John Morrissey, who definitely falls on the can-do side of that divide. And I'm here today. So without any further ado, this is my film. Please temper your critical eye with the fact that I'm not a filmmaker. I'm just a jeweler trying to make a difference. So. In 1971, when President Nixon declared war on cancer, 1 in 30 of us would develop cancer in our lifetime. Today, that figure is 1 in 3. Dramatic changes in our food chain and lifestyles fuel this epidemic, with the World Health Organization forecasting a 75% increase in cancer cases by 2030. Conversely, the cold fact is that despite trillions being spent on research, we have not cured a single cancer since the 1970s. So if this is a war on cancer, then we are staring defeat in the face. We are little closer to overcoming metastasis or malignancy, the holy grails of oncology, than we were 50 years ago. Is it possible that a tiny colony of malignant brain cancer survivors, the most deadly of all cancers, hold the key to a dramatic improvement in all cancer therapies tomorrow? Could the next great stride forward in the field of oncology be simply a change in strategy as opposed to a new drug or technology? And what happens if that change in approach directly contravenes established medical practice and the entire clinical trial structure we have built for testing cancer treatments?
I think that many of these brain tumors and other kinds of cancers are treatable. I just think that a mountain of evidence is being overlooked.
If you face this disease and say from the get-go that it is incurable, you will always be right, all your patients will die, and you have no business treating those patients in the first place.
I would not be alive today if I had listened only to the advice of my oncologist. Because at one point he told me that, well, you should really consider just staying home now and playing with your little daughter while you can, and not pursue any aggressive treatments. But I decided otherwise.
The truth of the matter is, although we talk a lot about change, there's only one human organism in the entire planet that actually likes change. That happens to be a 6-month-old baby with a dirty diaper. Other than that, No one wants to change. We want someone else or something else to change, but not us. And so whether it's an individual or an organization like the Food and Drug Administration, change is difficult.
It's so obvious that if the FDA allowed us to be rational about treating cancer patients, we could move the ball 100 times faster, as we did with AIDS. The AIDS guys did it. The cancer patients have to do it. We have to force Congress to change legislation so that when a doctor and a patient agree that the benefits exceed the potential risk, that should go. Whatever way we make it, it's got to go.
There are people suffering and dying from diseases like glioblastoma multiforme or Alzheimer's or many, many other diseases for which now today we potentially have within our grasp right now the ability to radically change that, to save those lives and offset the suffering. So you need that compelling vision that's there. In the United States, at some time in the past, we said, the moon is there. We're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back in a decade. We can do that now and say, cancer is there, Alzheimer's is there, diabetes is there, and we can change that today.
I have discovered that Institutional Review Board functioning is evidence-free. You can publish anything you want to about it, and they ignore it. Nothing ever happens. They have their manual they pull out of their back pocket. If it's in the manual, they will do it. If it's not in the manual, they don't. I said to myself, having published several articles with no result whatsoever, how can I intervene in this? And I realize most people have two back pockets, right? So I'm writing a manual to go in the other back pocket. And I have, in fact, nearly finished a manual coming out next summer through Springer, telling IRB members such surprising truths as, you shouldn't slow down the research without a good reason. You shouldn't monkey with the consent form if it's going to delay the research by a month and make no difference. You shouldn't fiddle with the science if you don't know what you're doing. And guys, generally speaking, just back off. Let the research happen, okay? Just play it cool. Now, I am under no delusion that this will transform the system because I know it won't. I'm just hoping to ameliorate the problem a little bit. But for a bigger solution, a more permanent solution, we need to go up the food chain. The next obvious step is to intervene with OHRP. Now, when you set up a regulatory system and you set up a federal agency to monitor it, and it has 26 employees and $9 million, those folks don't want to go away. They like their job. They like the office with a flag in the corner. They like the government pension they'll get eventually. They think their work is important, and in fact, they think it's very ethical. You are not going to be able to get these guys to say, gee, we shouldn't be doing this. Not going to happen. But because the system was founded on a fundamental mistake, because the system was founded on only the importance of protecting subjects and not on the importance of permitting research, it cannot be reformed by half measures. It cannot be improved around the edges. You have to take the system by the hand and say to it nicely, we're going to go for a little walk now. And you have to take it in the backyard. And you have to dig a very deep hole. And you have to say, now cover your eyes, this will only hurt for a moment. And you shoot it in the head and let it drop into the hole. And then you bury it. This is the kind of reform that will work. OHRP is not going to do this to itself. But Congress can and will. Congress is not invested in any minor federal agency. Congress cares about doing things that make sense. Now, I can't change Congress's mind. And we can't change Congress's mind. But if enough of us speak up to enough other people, and enough scientists say, I can't cure these diseases, because of the handcuffs this system placed on me. If enough scientists speak up and say this, and enough patient advocacy groups saying, we need help, then what's called an act of Congress, as if it were impossible, suddenly becomes inevitable. If we work together to change what's broken, change will happen. That's why I'm so pleased to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me, John.
But a few definitions, getting back to basics, I think is always a good idea when you're talking about beginning to change something. And people don't usually go back and look at the definition of a word when they use it. So what is a gap? Well, it's an unfilled space or interval, a break in continuity. I think we all know we have that in the way we develop drugs. In this case, it's the gap between hope and cures that we're talking about today. It's a wide difference in character or attitude, and the generation gap is an example of that. But we have another problem with this one in medicine, and exchange the word attitude with culture. And the culture of medicine is very stodgy, very stuck, very slow to change, and very procedure and process and belief driven. For example, the belief in the randomized controlled trial is not based on scientific proof. It's just a belief. It's the only thing we've ever tried. It's just a belief, so we continue to do it. It's the gold standard. My definition of gap in this case is the difference between where we are and where we should be. If over the last 50 years we had allowed our system to change as we accumulated knowledge, we probably wouldn't need to be here today. And that's really catastrophic, because many people in this room have lost loved ones to cancer. Had we not locked in to the way we're doing things and tried so hard to preserve it by making it more cumbersome, by trying to fix the problems by adding to it, would some of our loved ones be alive? And I think the answer is unquestioningly yes. Hope. We all know what hope is. Hope is a serious thing. It's a light thing. We all have it. We all use it every day. We use it in every facet of our lives. What happened there? Okay, there we go. And hope ranges from trivial to extremely serious. I really hope my team wins. We all do that on Sunday if you're a football fan. I hope I get a raise. That's pretty important. Take care of your kids, send them to college. I hope I don't have cancer. How many people in here have thought they might have had cancer, gone to the doctor, and either found out they did or they didn't? A lot of the people that happen to that we know are gone. But you have a spot on your face. Is it melanoma? Is it squamous? You have a lump on your breast. Something's going on, or there's something on your mammogram. You might have cancer. It's a big deal, and you hope you don't have it. Okay, go Gophers. We're in Minnesota. Down to the second line. I hope we have steak and lobster for dinner, but we're probably not going to have steak and lobster, and it'll be fine. I hope my daughter gets accepted to UM Medical School. It's kind of a big deal. My wife and I have a daughter in New England College in Maine studying occupational therapy, and we were very happy when she got into a good school. I hope someone gets home from the war, somebody I care about gets home from Afghanistan safely. That's a big hope. But when you're dying from cancer, I hope I qualify for the clinical trial is a big, big deal. Even if it's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, because it's your only chance. And most of the time, you don't. And that's crushing, by the way. This is the big one. I hope someone is working on a treatment for my cancer. For rare diseases, this is a huge deal. And in most cases, no one is. Because the money's not there, the market's not there. And it's not that the interest isn't there. It's just it can't happen in our current system. If there is something in the pipeline, hoping that it gets to you in time if you've already been diagnosed is kind of a pipe dream. Our system is so slow and so unresponsive to the needs of people with cancer, or any disease, any serious and life-threatening disease, that if you've already been diagnosed, and as John said last night, you don't have 7-10 years to wait, doesn't matter how far along in the process it is, you're probably not going to get it before you die. And that's the last one. And that's what happens time and time and time and time again. Our access programs don't work, our clinical trials aren't big enough, aren't accessible enough, and they can't be. The trials are off-putting, they're restrictive. It takes 10, 15, 20, 30 years for a drug And by the way, drugs don't work because of clinical trials. Drugs work because they work. Trials is how we measure whether they work. That's an important point. And we need to remember what clinical trials are. They're just a measurement tool, and we can change them. We need to change them. So what is hope to medical progress? And you can read this yourself, except for the bottom. Nothing makes my blood boil more than when I hear someone say that someone trying to gain access to something that's in development represents false hope. Every single thing we are doing in trying to make medical progress is driven by the hopes of patients. And if you are a clinical researcher or a patient advocate or a policy person who says that a patient who wants to live, who's run out of things that are approved, or there is nothing that is approved, and wants to try something that isn't yet approved, is suffering from a case of false hope, then I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to know you. And if you're a clinical researcher and you say that, then what you're saying is no one should enroll in your clinical trials ever again. That is wrong. There is no such thing as false hope, and it needs to be banished from the lexicon. And you can hear my anger about this. Every time I hear that, it drives me nuts. You want to kill the system of finding cures? Tell people trying new ideas is false hope. It isn't. It's where all the drugs we have came from, and it's where all the drugs we ever will have come from. It's not false hope. It's absolutely essential that we have hope.
I talked about information gathering. Well, what about treatment decisions? Well, prior to the 80s, it was a pretty doctor-centric model. You know, you went to the doctor, and the doctor said, this is what you're going to do, and if you didn't like it, you went to another doctor. You know, starting in the late 80s, 90s, there was much more of a collaborative model. There was a little bit more information going around. And patients and doctors would maybe decide together, like for breast cancer, do I want to do a radical mastectomy or not? The data was starting to come out that maybe that wasn't the best approach in terms of breast cancer, where some institutions or some doctors did, some doctors didn't, and the patients began to shop for their particular type of doctors that fit their model of treatment. Well, following in the late 90s and certainly now, with the freedom of the internet, patients sometimes are actually choosing their own therapy. In 1999, I walked into a patient's room, and this guy was Bill Gates' partner number 22, who left Microsoft and wound up writing the programs that run 9 out of 10 of the world's paper mills. He developed a brain tumor, came down to Cedars, and got operated on. 6 hours after his surgery, I walked into his room to see how he's doing. He is hunched over his laptop computer and not looking at me. And I said, hello, Mike, how are you doing? And he said, okay, you know, for after surgery. And had just had an oligoastrocytoma removed from his brain. And I said, well, you know, you're feeling okay? And you headache? He says, no, the medicine's okay. He said, I'm a little groggy. And he said, what do you know about the 19p deletion? I said, huh? He presses a button on his computer. The printer next to his hospital bed spews out 6 pages. And there's the study that was published 1 week before on the role of the 19p deletion in oligoastrocytoma, suggesting that it's a very chemosensitive tumor. He hands me the paper and says, go read it and come back and talk to me tomorrow morning. That was my first real example of the democratization of cancer therapy. And he, in fact, had the 19p deletion, and he wound up responding to chemotherapy.
I firmly believe that for technology to influence society, it has to be productized in some way. We're not going to talk about costs and expense because I believe that that is something that is far more manageable than we often give ourselves credit for. But the single approval of a meaningful cellular medicine product will drive successes in a whole landscape of applications. So it's interesting that stem cells have been in the vernacular for the better part of 20 years. We are still waiting for that breakthrough approval. I believe that a drug that gets to phase 3 should never be failed and should always gain approval. I actually think that it's the regulatory obligation to use the most sophisticated technologies to interrogate the responders and the non-responders and identify a basis to approve, even if that approval is for a very, very limited subset of the overall initial target. The reason being, it's better than flushing the money that's been invested down the toilet. Okay? And there are many examples of drugs that work in a very, very tiny population but have such incredibly compelling efficacy that they literally change the lives of those individuals. And the more that we get to see these products in use clinically, that is after they've been commercialized, because let's face it, patients receiving an experimental therapeutic in a clinical trial, they are not representative of how patients are treated with that same product once it's commercialized. The users are different, the clinicians are different, the patient selection criteria are different. You learn a lot more in that post-market period than you ever learn in a phase 3 program.
So I'm not sure how obvious this is to most people. 55% of drugs used in America don't work for the patients they're prescribed for. So these are drugs that are FDA approved, fully reimbursed. So we're saying more than half of the scripts written don't work for the individual patients. That's kind of astounding, right? And the implications are pretty big. In a little bit more detail, this is from the Personalized Medicine Coalition. This is looking disease area by disease area, what the percent of patients who don't respond to any given drug are. So for asthma drugs, 40% of patients don't respond to any one of the given FDA-approved drugs fully reimbursed by insurance. Arthritis, worse, 50%. Okay, cancer drugs, even worse, 3 out of 4. Okay. And this is not news, should not be news to anyone in this room, but the implications are grand, and this is not just about drugs, this is about healthcare interventions in general. Medical devices, surgeries, doctor visits, what have you. And drugs are probably held to the highest standard of evidence compared to any other intervention, but yet, more than half the time, those drugs don't work for a particular patient. And so this is one that's really horrible for patients, but it's also horrible for a healthcare system that is topping $2.7 trillion a year and threatening to bankrupt much of the U.S. economy. And so this has big patient and clinical implications, but also has big money implications, because if half of the interventions out of the 2.7 trillion aren't working, it also means we're wasting hundreds of billions of dollars. I've often pegged that number to be 500 billion. And simply as a matching problem, not the stuff that Obamacare tries to fix, that does its role in helping to catalyze interest in solving this, but here we're talking about knowledge blind spots. This is data. This is one of the early Bert Vogelstein results from Johns Hopkins looking at lung cancer patients, 22 of them, where DNA sequencing was applied to several tumor suppressor genes as well as oncogenes. And the thing you take away, so in yellow deletions, blue mutations, red amplifications, the thing you take away is, well, geez, none of these patients actually have the same thing wrong with them, right? They all have a different set of things that have gone wrong in the genetic circuitry of their tumor. So how could it ever make sense that we expect the same drugs to work on them? Right now, today, our system is set up first-line therapies, second-line therapies, third-line, fourth-line, what have you. There's a standard of care for a hypothetical average patient. And as genomic medicine is revealing more and more about the underlying mechanisms and the actual stuff that gives rise to disease, we're seeing that notion is outdated. It was essentially wrong to begin with. We might have been using the best thing we could before, but now it's really obvious. And the analogy I like to use is suppose we operated a radio repair business, right? And so people would come in with various kinds of broken radios and such, but we use the same method to fix it every time. We thought just putting in a new antenna was going to be the solution to every broken radio, and that's, of course, ridiculous. but that is how we do approach treatment today.
I am happy to be here. Basically, I'm the end of the day. I'm the patient. I'm the bottom of the pyramid that everything's balanced on here. The person who pays for everything, the person who pays all the insurances, and the person who basically receives the care. The person who should be setting the goals about care and the doctor delivering on those goals is what really determines value, not a dollar figure. Value is different to all of us, apart from the My Life is Worth It entity that I'm with Bob Goldberg. Patient and doctor access and choice to care to deliver whatever it can to that patient what they want. 3 months in advance sounds like nothing. That person, the next time, it could be 6 months, it could be a year. We could actually find a cure. And that's what we have to do. We have to move the averages. As a patient, we want the chance to live longer. Patients will make their choice. Some people do, unfortunately, want to end earlier because, as described last night, the patient has been given no hope. What you are doing and all your research provides us hope. But now things are blocking it in the process. We need to make every member of that value chain urgent and see what is going on in the process. And if any of them don't, we basically have to push them out of the way. We have to get in front of them. We have to embarrass them. And it's not just going to be economically, it is going to be media and publicly related, saying, what are you doing to deny people care? It's not a sob story, it's fact. When millions of people are dying and suffering needlessly, it's a bad process. When I get angry at some of these things, which I usually do thinking about it, my process was easy. My function went through, knock on wood, I would have died in early 2009, but I responded to RevDex very well. Had the autologous stem cell transplant and maintenance dose Rev ever since. But I get into saying someone's going to live only a few months. If you ever say that to a patient, I feel sorry for you, and extremely for the patient. What does only mean for a patient? If they told me I was only going to live a year, I could put a hell of a lot of life into that 1 year. You tell me the medicine's only going to increase my life for 3 months, I would basically say, fine, go in, take some pelvic samples of me, see how I respond, I'll pass it on to the next person. They'll live a year, and then they'll live 5, and they'll live 10. Progress will be made. And progress only comes basically from patient-led initiatives. Don't say patient-centric. The version of a circle with a patient in the middle to me looks like, dare I say, someone's going to take a bow and arrow and take a pop at us. It's patient-led. It goes out from the patient. Everything comes from them at the start. I don't know how I got the disease. We'll eventually figure that out. So it's kind of like my genes went wild. I lost the genetic lottery. All the work you're doing hopefully allows me, if everything works right, to roll the dice, to live longer, and beat the odds. That's all I care about. And my family cares about it. I've been able to go through. When I was diagnosed, my mom-in-law was having her second colon cancer operation. My daughter was a freshman in school. My wife was tortured and terrified. I don't want her to ever go through that again. I want her to know at the end of the day there is hope. You provide it, and thanks for that process.